mean, he turned up everywhere we were. He was on every corner, outside every door. He climbed scaffolding to get into one of the flats where he thought we were. He would brawl in the street with my boyfriend if he could find him. And he did, in fact, early on attack him really quite viciously. The police got involved, but because, it was really a brutal attack. He attacked him from behind with a crowbar. Luckily, it was in daylight, and someone else saw and rescued my boyfriend. But the police never found what it was he used. They never found the blunt instrument.
I'm Jamie Beebe.
And I'm Jake Deptula. On today's episode of Strictly Stalking, we're chatting with author and stalking survivor Christine Wood.
At 19, while attending art school, Christine met a tall, charming man 15 years her senior.
During their 2-year courtship, Christine tried to dismiss her intuition that their relationship was threaded with lies.
After they broke up, her ex hired private detectives to keep tabs on her and phoned her workplace daily, trying to outwit secretaries into revealing her home address.
His stalking turned violent when he brutally attacked Christine's new boyfriend.
Christine is here to reveal details of her horrific decades-long ordeal as explored in her new book, The Stalker's Tale. Christine, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
What was your life like growing up?
I had an interesting childhood. We were an artist family. My father was a painter. My mother was, they were sort of what we call in London, sort of bohemian intellectuals. My father's passion was painting. And my mother was very well read. They were, they were bohemians, really. But their marriage wasn't entirely happy. It was very turbulent. So, and I'm an only child. So I was brought up, on the one hand, we traveled a lot. We did lots of interesting things. We went to the theatre and to cinema. My mother read every new book that came out. But they also had the most spectacular rows, really, really kind of spectacular rows. And so I grew up becoming almost like a little diplomat between them. I was the one who could calm things down at times. I couldn't always calm things down. Sometimes it was just too much, but they both, to a certain extent, relied on me to keep the peace as much as was possible. So I suppose I did that typical thing of following one's parents' lead. I painted seriously through my 20s, even though I did some writing at that time, some very minor journalism. I wrote some television and restaurant reviews, but I thought of myself as a painter, really, during my 20s.
How did you meet your stalker?
I met him in the second year of art school. He was older than I am, considerably older. He was certainly very charming. I can remember him. I can remember the first time I saw him. He had a kind of throwaway charm, a kind of careless rapture about him. But I was very young. My life at that point was very chaotic. Our family had broken up at that point. My parents had separated. I had parted from my very first boyfriend, whom I was planning to marry. We had, to my shame, I had left him. And at almost in the same time, our family life, which despite all the turbulence had seemed quite stable, just almost dissolved overnight. My mother used to taunt my father, why aren't you like other men? Why don't you have a girlfriend? Well, of course, those were fatal words. Eventually he did exactly that. He took a girlfriend. And from that point onwards, everything changed dramatically and very, very fast. So at the time when I met the stalker, I was sort of emotionally untethered, really. I was, I really didn't know who to trust. My mother and I were not getting on because she was so furious. She was in such a state of absolute fury about my father. She wanted me to go to his office and attack him in front of his colleagues. She did herself succeed in getting him the sack from various jobs because by now he was working in advertising. And it was just, I can remember I was about 19 at this point, and I just remember being shocked by how quickly things that seemed stable could just dissolve completely. So I wasn't in a good frame of mind, but at the same time, I always had an instinct that there was something not quite right about this man. And in fact, it was my mother who encouraged him more than I did. And now, in retrospect, I realize I was too young to realize that my mother was lonely and had her own emotional needs. She too was untethered. And I think she was attracted to him more than I was. And I think she encouraged him much more than I did. And for a long time, we were just art school colleagues and friends. It wasn't a great immediate sort of getting together with him. But then my mother discovered that I was still seeing my father secretly because she couldn't bear the idea that I would have anything to do with him. And so she threw me out of the flat where we were living in this, having had a wonderful home that we all loved and that we were all sort of committed to. Very beautiful house in the country. Suddenly my mother and I were living in a really pitiful, small, cramped flat that she had rented that was alien to everything that we knew and understood. And it was just very bleak, I was young, and it all felt unnatural, I suppose. But then she threw me out of the flat, and so I started sleeping on people's floors and sofas, that sort of thing. And that was when the man who became my stalker made his move, really. And now, in retrospect, I wish that I had heeded my own instincts. I was still at that point, I always had strong instincts about things, but I used to out-argue myself. I would think, this is nonsense, why would you think that? Now I know that one has to observe, you have to abide by those instincts. So he and I got together, and this made my mother even more furious. I think now, I didn't really realize at the time, but I think now she was jealous, actually, of her own daughter, which is sad. And she was a very attractive woman, and she had every good reason to think that men should desire her and find her attractive. But I, as her daughter, didn't really perceive that at that age. Even though I was sort of suddenly cut off from my mother and I started living with this man, I always tried to escape. Right through those 2 years, I was constantly going off and getting separate digs of my own. I didn't really want ever to be completely dependent on him. But he always chased after me, always persuading me to come back. So when I finally left him, he didn't really believe that I was leaving him. I think he just thought it was another episode where I would go off and come back again, live elsewhere and come back. But during those 2 years, I discovered that he was really a very erratic personality. And far from either liking him or admiring him, I started to really dislike him. I disliked his treatment of other people. He often, he started to express not a very confirmed racist view of things, but it was like a subtext that ran through things. He was always full of throwaway laughter, but he was cruel. There was a cruelty there. Just things happened, and his behavior was erratic beyond words. I thought that I was sophisticated enough because I'd handled all this erratic behavior of my parents. I thought I was sophisticated enough to deal with it, but it was completely beyond me. I mean, it was, I was just very stupid and overestimating my own capacities. I was also ludicrously overconfident. I mean, I was a young woman who um, had a certain amount of emotional curiosity, probably too much really, and thought I could do things which now I know my own limitations, but I didn't really know them then.
In the world of clothes shopping, there are no consistent sizes. Why should we have to try to guess if a medium is really a medium, or constantly have to return clothes purchased online to find something that fits perfectly?
And fashion changes, true style doesn't. Even so, your timeless look can use a pick-me-up every once in a while. Get help from someone who gets what you're looking for, without ever leaving home, with a Stitch Fix styling expert.
Stitch Fix is a personal styling company that brings you the world of fashion and style. It's a completely different and fun way to find clothes that you will love. It's all about you every time.
To get started, go to stitchfix.com/stalking to set up your profile, and they'll deliver great looks personalized just for you, in your colors, styles, and budget.
You pay a $20 styling fee for each fix, which is credited towards anything you keep. Schedule at any time, there's no subscription required, plus shipping, returns, and exchanges are easy and free.
Stitch Fix does the hard work for you, making great style effortless for everybody, including women, men, and kids.
Get started today at stitchfix.com/stalking and you'll get 25% off when you keep everything in your fix.
That's stitchfix.com/stalking for 25% off when you keep everything in your fix.
stitchfix.com/stalking.
What was your first impression of your stalker?
My first impression was of someone who walked into a room, quite a big presence in the room, not without charm, but this kind of throwaway quality. I mean, I can remember him walking into a studio the first day I saw him. He was carrying lots of equipment. He was carrying things like paints and brushes and portfolios, and dropping them as he went. Everything was a kind of clatter. And then he stood back and laughed. I mean, he laughed at everything, a kind of dangerous laughter, really. Not a laughter that everyone joined in with, but there was something off about it.
When did you first start seeing the red flags when you were living with him?
I think I started to realize that he wasn't tremendously good in company, that he was someone who needed it just to be the two of us. I've always been very gregarious, so I've always been interested in friendship. I like friendships, and he was nervous of the friendships that I made. So that was one thing, and he did things which one couldn't begin to understand, erratic things that were really a little mad when I look back on them. I think he was unbalanced.
What was it like when you first left him?
Oh, I mean, from that time onwards, as soon as he realized that I was with this other boyfriend, who was someone my own age, the campaign against us was, I mean, I knew that it would be troublesome. I knew that leaving him, I had to almost pretend that I wasn't leaving him in order to do so. But I had no idea that it could be as it has been. I mean, I couldn't have conceived of it, I was about 21. He turned up everywhere we were, he was on every corner, outside every door. He climbed scaffolding to get into one of the flats where he thought we were. He would brawl in the street with my boyfriend if he could find him. And he did, in fact, early on attack him really quite viciously. The police got involved, but because, I mean, it was really a brutal attack. He attacked him from behind with a crowbar. Luckily, it was in daylight and someone else saw and rescued my boyfriend. But the police never found what it was he used. They never found the blunt instrument, whatever it was he used. And I don't know, the police never really, my experience of the police has not been really tremendously good in the sense, I mean, I think at the time they just considered all these things as domestic incidents. And the other thing I began to realize about the police, the police were involved for the first 15 years of all this, repeatedly. That when stalking begins, you always think that the police are going to be able to stop it. It takes years to realize that whatever powers they have aren't actually sufficient to stop it, to prevent it. You can send people to prison for a couple of years or a few months, but that doesn't put an end to the stalking. They still come back and start it all over again. In that sense, it's more like an addiction. It's more like someone who is addicted to drink or drugs. They just cannot give up. And the other thing I learnt about calling the police is that they were so indiscreet. They would share information, so that all the time we were trying to prevent him from having information, and they were casually giving it away. But nevertheless, I don't know why, but the police were called after that assault. But because they couldn't find the weapon, and because he is such a plausible liar, he is unbelievably plausible. Whether in court or, if a policeman is standing, he will immediately set out to charm the police. He lies with a kind of fluency that sort of takes one's breath away. He just has that kind of instinct for self-survival that most of us don't actually have.
Jake, do you know what my favorite thing is about my new DrinkWorks machine?
The drinks?
Well, yes, but also that it's so convenient. I just choose a drink, insert the pod, and in under 60 seconds, I've got a perfectly chilled cocktail or mixed drink. On demand, all from the comfort of home. No shopping or messy cleanup.
It works just like a fancy espresso machine. Just press a button and the machine does the rest. Only it's premium cocktails, not coffee.
There's so much variety, too. Flavors for everyone's taste, from tropical cocktails to classic mixed drinks, even sangria and rosé spritzers. With more than 25 drinks, it's the perfect way to try an old favorite or find a new one. I recently started loving those Long Island iced teas.
Don't forget the new Jack Daniel's Lemonade. It combines refreshing lemonade with premium Jack Daniel's whiskey. I've seen you enjoy a couple of those on your Instagram at FeatherGirl77.
Definitely a fan favorite at my summer get-togethers.
The best way to get this amazing drink maker is go to drinkworks.com. That's DRINKWORKS.com.
They've already taken $100 off the price, and now they'll even throw in free shipping. It's the best deal they're offering, and it's for a limited time, so don't wait.
That's drinkworks.com. Get yours today.
And remember, please enjoy responsibly.
When was the first time you realized that he was stalking you?
I don't think there was, it was all so clustered together. It was so repetitious. It was just within about 3 or 4 months of my first leaving him and him discovering that I actually had another boyfriend. And then from that point onwards, it was just full on, any day, any moment. He tracked us down everywhere. He eventually employed private detectives. But even before that, he persuaded friends of his to spy on us.
Walk us through the escalation of his stalking through the years.
Well, I would say that for the first 15 years, it was pretty full on, really. He always found out where we were living. I can't remember how, but he knew the telephone number where we were living. We would go out into the street and there would be people checking photographs to see that they were trailing after the right person. We were a short distance from the underground, the tube station where we were living. It was touch and go whether we could actually make that distance without being stopped by him. I was at university by that point. He would turn up at the university. And then after I left, because eventually we were worn out, he would ring at 2:00 in the morning. With these we were living with other people, sharing a flat with other people. So whoever picked up the phone would receive these kind of nasty, insidious, And he would write to me twice a day. I mean, we were bombarded with letters, just bombarded. Over the years, I've received thousands and thousands of letters, which I've never replied to, not one. Extraordinary. I mean, that someone, and even now, all these years later, he writes letters as though it was just yesterday. I don't even know how he does it, how he's managed to keep all this so clean in his own mind, you know. After 10 years, my boyfriend and I were worn out and we parted. So he had succeeded in what he always wanted to do, which was to separate us. I took a job outside London in order to get away from him. But he tricked a woman friend, some woman, to ring my father and find out where I was living. He didn't find out where I was living, but he found out where I was working. And he would do things like ring up the secretaries and pretend that he was from the post office and had to deliver a parcel and needed my home address. I had to warn everyone, you know, that any phone call that came through the administration for me had to be treated suspiciously. He would turn up not quite as often now, because I don't know what he was doing, whether he had a job in London, but it wasn't quite so convenient for him to always be outside London, you know, tracking me down. He would send presents to where I was working. You know, one could never ever you could never really be completely relaxed about it. You know, the other thing that happened, which was just at the end of the 10 years, was that we encountered him at some event. I mean, this was just when I was still with my boyfriend. We encountered him at some event. There was immediately a brawl, and then because all the bouncers came in and separated us, and because he had in fact created an injury, the police eventually again got involved. And this time it went to court. It was 4 days in court. And again, he lied so plausibly, he was acquitted. But the judge had the evidence of all these endless times when he'd been bound over to keep the peace. And in those days, it was just for derisory sums, you know, £100 there, 100, and he was wealthy enough not to care. But because the judge saw, which the jury didn't, that he had this sort of history of pestering, he refused to give him costs. And although he is wealthy, the cost of having attorneys in court 4 days, privately paid. He'd also got old colleagues of us from art school over from abroad to act as witnesses on his behalf. And that is also where I've discovered that a woman who had once been a friend of mine was now with him. I had no idea until I met her in court. And she perjured herself in order to support him. So he was acquitted, but he still, at that point, he had this enormous bill to pay. And that finally did seem to have some effect. It just, it didn't stop him stalking me, but it made him more circumspect, slightly more circumspect, less violent maybe. But also it got to the point, after 15 years of this, I began to, and it made me unwell, you know, I became unwell, and it got to the point where I wondered what else could he do to me, you know, he could kill me, but beyond, you know, other than that, he'd done everything, really. I mean, he had destroyed so much of my life, so many of the things that I cared about. And so I just decided that I had to train myself, really, to almost handle this myself. You know, resorting to the police wasn't a success. So I became a kind of connoisseur, really, of him. I mean, began to notice all the signs of his behavior. I began to know when he was at his most mad, when he was at his most dangerous, when I had to be my most wary. And I'm still like that. I still know that perfectly well all these years later.
How did you go about learning about him?
He and I have had no civil exchanges of conversation for decades, but he writes to me. He still writes to me all the time. So I've always had a record of his state of mind. Um, and sometimes he just writes sort of silly little, all my love, here I am thinking of you, the sort of stuff that girls write to each other. Um, but occasionally there would be something really quite sinister. There were certain moods where he was in a more dangerous mood. And at those moments, he always called me Christina rather than Christine. No one called me Christina apart from my mother and father. But I always know that if he writes to me as Christina, that I have to be extra wary. And also, when I came back to London, which I did eventually, um, again, he got to know about my address. He still has my address, but he doesn't have my telephone number, and I'm not on any social media. So, although he can write to me, I'm ex-directory. My phones are ex-directory. He can't track me down in that way. I can recognize the sound that he makes by just pressing my doorbell. I recognize it. Ridiculous,
How often were you in fear of your life? Did you think that he was going to hurt you or possibly kill you?
I think I may have felt that in the early years. I'm talking about the first 15 years, which is still quite a long time. He came here the other day, about 3 weeks ago, and I did actually answer the doorbell and heard his voice. And that did upset me for 2 hours. For 2 hours, I felt all the kind of jitteriness of someone who is outside waiting for you, but after that, I've trained myself to just forget it. I've trained myself to almost flip into another mode. I still wary. I never lose my wariness, but I've trained myself to not feel quite so afraid, because the thing is that otherwise your whole life becomes focused just on fear. In the same way that if you resort all the time to using the police, you spend your life in litigation. You spend all your time writing reports, complaining. So actually, he's already won. He's all the time in one's head. And I wanted to lead a life that was way beyond him. I don't want to spend my life thinking about him in that sort of everyday sense. So, from my point of view, it's been better to become very sus about the signs of his dementedness, right? And be extra wary when I know that he's in what I call a loop of madness.
Has he ever served any prison time or anything for this?
No, he hasn't.
And has he ever physically hurt you in these years?
No, he hasn't physically hurt me, but he would hurt anyone who was aligned to me. I have created a world for myself where he would have immense difficulty in infiltrating the world that I know. I ruthlessly stopped any contact with any of the people that we had known together, even people who I was friendly with. I just had to completely cut them off. I'm not only protecting myself; I'm protecting anyone who's close to me. I don't trust him. I think if he saw me with another man, he would still behave as he did with that boyfriend. Well, except that, he's older now.
How did your friends and family react when they found out he's been stalking you all these years?
Well, a lot of them knew, but a lot didn't know, because it's not something I talk about generally. I don't go to dinner parties and talk about this, not usually. But since I've published this book, some friends who've known me for a long time have been shocked to learn that all of this has been going on during the time that they knew me, that they have known me. They just didn't realize, because a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people, I find, have a kind of emotional naivety where they can't. Their first reaction is always, well, it must have stopped by now, which it hasn't. They can't conceive of something that goes on this long. I don't blame them. I mean, who could conceive of something that goes on for decades? I mean, the reason I wanted to write the book was that my experience of stalking is commonplace. A friend the other day told me that apparently the statistics are that one woman in 5 over the age of 16 has been stalked. But the thing that makes my situation slightly different is the length of time it's gone on. And of course, what happens, I mean, it hasn't only happened in my life, it's happened in his life too, which is that life takes over. Even against all his obsessions, life has taken over. He married this woman that I was once friends with, and so on and so forth. I mean, it hasn't stopped him stalking me, but he has lived a life that he hasn't just been isolated any more than I have.
And how many years has it been?
More than 40. Really is decade after decade.
Has he ever let up?
No. I think what happens with this kind of, I think it's a sort of mental illness, and I think it is a form of addiction. And in the abstract, one would feel sympathy for someone who is, because I mean, he must be suffering too. This is not a pleasant thing for him either, or for a stalker. Stalkers create their own tragedy as well as other people's. But because they handle their stalking, and this is true of all stalkers, with such low cunning and such nastiness, real nastiness, and malevolent intent, it's impossible to like them, let alone love them. You just cannot like them. I can't forgive this man for the harm he's done. But at the same time, in the abstract, I can see that allowing the police to handle this is mental illness of some sort. I'm not sure that the police, they handle it because these men commit crimes. They enter buildings, they trespass, they will commit any crime that allows them to get what they want. But behind it is not really, is a mental problem.
When did you first decide to write the book?
Well, I think I decided because I've been writing quite a long time. I've written other things before I wrote this novel. I've written other novels. So I think I always felt that I probably would write it. But on the other hand, I realized it was not going to be a simple thing to write, that it had to be done well. It had to be done thoroughly. This isn't something to just sort of write glibly in any way. And so I also realized that in terms of writing a novel, I mean, I like all victims of stalking. I read everything about stalking that I see. If there's a television program about stalking, I watch it. If there's a report in a paper, I read it. And I've read novels about stalking. And the thing that I began to observe is that although these stories are very compelling, but they're also strangely claustrophobic, because it's always a baddie versus a goodie. It's just like a two-hander, like a play that's like a two-hander. Well, I didn't want that. I wanted to set this long-term stalking. I wanted to write about those early violent years when it does feel like it's just him and them, him and us. But I also wanted to show how it affects other people. It affects a sort of much broader story. So, and I also realized that it's not interesting in the end to have a character who has no redeeming qualities at all. So the thing that everyone comments about this book I've written is that it has, the stalker has, he's a terrible character, but at the same time, he's almost someone who in part one can sympathize with. One realizes his tragedy in the book as well as hers. And a lot of people seem to have liked that, the fact that his personality is explored beyond the kind of two-dimensional element of someone who is just behaving badly all the time.
Do you know if your stalker is aware of the book?
I don't think he is yet. I hope he never does become aware of it. I'm not sure that he would be a great reader. I mean, I hope it doesn't really get on his radar. But, there's no knowing how these people will respond. He'd probably be quite proud of it.
He's still stalking you on a regular basis to this day?
Well, he stalks me in the sense that, as I say, a few weeks ago, he turned up here. He hadn't done that for a while. He writes to me every 3 or 4 weeks. Letters which I keep, because that is one thing I do. I keep all these letters in case I should ever need to resort to the police again. So I have an extraordinary collection of letters from a stalker. So many that it's hard to find where to put them, But it's not stalking in the sense that it was in those early years. He's got worn out too,
How has the content of the letters varied over the years?
I think the very early letters, which of the first 10 years, which I don't have those, I didn't keep those, but they were violent and nasty and threatening. But what happens now with the letters is they're mostly, he's mostly trying to cajole me into, he thinks I'm like a child who's made a silly mistake, and after he turned up here a few weeks ago, this is 3 or 4 weeks ago, he wrote a letter saying that he hoped I was all right, but that he knew really that I would never be all right again until I was back with him. Well, that's about as ludicrous as it gets, We haven't spoken for more than 40 years. He doesn't know me. He just thinks he knows me, And I don't know him, but we live this kind of parallel existence, both of us having to be aware of each other, but actually ignorant of each other. It's a sort of mad situation. But to go back to your question, now mostly the letters are what I would call anodyne. They're sort of they're he writes things that you couldn't really object to. You couldn't show them to the police, and the police wouldn't act on them because they don't contain. But every so often there's a kind of mad threat in them, not a threat, an open threat of violence, but a kind of undercurrent of something really nasty.
Do you think it will ever stop?
No, I don't. I don't believe it's possible for it to stop. And actually, interestingly, last year there was a very famous, famous to London, stalking case here of a woman who's in the media. Very prominent in the media, and she had been stalked for 20 years. And eventually, the man who stalked her was sent to prison. I can't remember for how long, not maybe a couple of years or whatever. But the interesting thing was that her stalker, admitted to the judge that he himself couldn't see an end to it. So, and that's really what I think. I don't think, people think, that there has to be a way of putting a stop to it. The police have to put a stop to it. But I don't think anyone can. I just think that it's like a mindset that is so aberrated, it cannot be modified. The only thing, if it's addiction, the only thing that causes an addiction to swerve is if it's focused on something else. People who are addicted to drink, for instance, or drugs can sometimes be, the focus of their addiction can sometimes be focus on something more benign. But unless that happens, I don't really believe there's any end to it.
And there was no change when he got married, or do you know if he has kids?
No, no. I mean, it just doesn't seem to have altered anything. He's a successful businessman. It's not. He's not just some sad creature who has no resources. He's a wily, low cunning creature. Who I also think that I think what I've just said is true about it being impossible to stop. But I also think that this. I mean, he writes everything in terms of love. He calls everything his love for me. But I think that's just false. I think this is really an act of hatred and vengeance. This is a man who cannot bear to be told no. And I'm sure that must be true of a lot of stalkers, that it is such an affront to his pride to have not won, that it cannot be accepted.
What do you want to see happen to your stalker? Do you think he can get help?
Well, I don't know. I don't even know enough about him to know whether he would ask for help, or whether I suspect that he actually is rather proud of his tenacity. I think that these people, stalkers, feel elevated by their persistence into a kind of spiritual hierarchy. I think they congratulate themselves on their passion. But for myself, I mean, it sounds. I don't mean I would wish this on him either unnaturally or viciously, but I just hope that he dies before I do, because I would like to, not in a cruel way, but just so that I have at least a few years of my adult life without this predatory presence hanging over it. Um, it's not an attractive thought, but actually I would just like to be free of him, completely free of him. And I can't see that ever happening unless before one of us dies.
Overall, how has your life changed from this experience?
Well, I'm probably financially poorer, like all victims of stalking. One never dares put you have to resist putting your head above the parapet. I can't. Not now; it's so late. But it you have to not court publicity. Because then he'd be immediately close to you. He would turn up. You have to you have to narrow your professional scope, if you like, in order to survive stalking. There's no point. But I think the other thing is that and this maybe is the only good thing, is that it rids one of all complacency. A lot of people, as they get older, seem to think that they've found the recipe for life. That they are, they know everything about life. That they feel, well, if you have been the victim of stalking, you don't have that luxury. You don't really get to be very pretentious, because there's always a monster, nearby, who would rid you of any pretensions you had as soon as you did anything extravagant. But you asked how my life is now. Actually, I have a life that I love. I'm part of a wonderful, intelligent circle. Bright, intelligent people, many of whom are writers or artists themselves. Loyal friends. It's a world that I hope he never manages to infiltrate.
What advice would you give any of our listeners who are dealing with a stalker?
Well, my main advice would be to resist reacting to everything they do. It's counterintuitive, but the truth is that stalkers, everything one does, it's like throwing meat into a ring of jackals. They everything you do is fed upon. So by never reacting, never writing a letter, never complaining, never doing anything, eventually you starve a stalker of his own opportunity. I mean, my stalker has started making things up about me because he's bereft of information. I mean that too is ludicrous, but that is what has started to happen. He writes to me as though I did things which I've never done, because he's decided and he has gone on to, he's gone on to sort of occult things, where he tries to make contact with me through the ethers, through ESP and all that kind of stuff. So he's all the time trying to find ways of contacting me other than any normal ways. The only thing I would say is that in order to do that, in order to not react to the stalking, you have to really have accepted within yourself, which might take years, that there is essentially nothing you can do about it. You can only behave as I do when you've had years of trying to do it otherwise.
Can you tell us more about the book, writing it, and what you wanted to accomplish by putting this story out there?
Well, the book is, which is called The Stalker's Tale, like a Chaucerian tale. The central spine of it is a story based on my experience of stalking, and but it's also got two other storylines. It's three separate storylines. It's the life of the stalker with his family, his wife, the life that he leads, quite separate from any life that I've ever led with him. There's the life of the woman who's being stalked, and there's also a historical story. So it's also a kind of family saga, because I wanted to, as I said earlier, I wanted to write a novel which has the scope of showing how other people whose lives have no idea of being directly affected by the stalking are nevertheless affected by it. So in that sense, it's got quite a broad scope, and I hope that by doing that, I hope I've given an insight into the mentality of the stalker. I think I have managed to do that. It may be given some people who have no concept of what a stalker's personality is like. Maybe I have succeeded in giving some clues to that. I hope I have, anyway. But also how other people react to stalking. They don't all react as you expect. Some people react in sympathy. I mean, one of the characters in my book appalls the woman who is stalked by reacting sympathetically to the stalker, in the sense that he senses his pain. He sees his pain rather than the actual malice of his stalking.
And where can we find your book?
Well, it's definitely on Kindle. I mean, it's been published by this wonderful company, Zuleika, who are a young, new company, but already hugely successful in Britain. And but I understand that the book is going to be available, the hard copy of the book is going to be available on demand in America as well. But you can definitely get it through Amazon, and as I say, it's definitely on Kindle.
Christine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I've managed to talk, which I normally I was completely frightened that I wouldn't really manage to talk too fluently. That I find it easier to write than to talk sometimes. But anyway, you've managed to make me talk. Thank you.
If anyone out there is in need of help or is a victim of stalking, please reach out. You can find a list of resources on our Instagram at StrictlyStalkingPod.
You can watch video of our episodes at youtube.com/StrictlyStalking.
And we're on Patreon, where you can sign up for exclusive bonus episodes, live chat sessions, and check out show merchandise. And that's patreon.com/StrictlyStalking.
I'm Jake Diptula.
And I'm Jamie Beebe. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Strictly Stalking.